Welcome back to Bioinsights. Today's conversation is one that I've been looking forward to for a while. We're going to go beyond the strength training and conditioning talking points and ask for probably some people, some uncomfortable questions. Um, the question really we talked about was, are we making better weightlifters or better athletes? Is the industry obsession with data points like maximal force or training actual holding us back in some cases? What does meaningful technology integration actually look like when you cut through the noise? So joining me today is a mentor, a good friend, Dr. Paul Juris. He's a movement scientist, a research pioneer, and someone who spent his career asking questions that really have challenged many of people. Paul's work with the MBA and Cybex International's research lab as well speaks for itself. What sets him apart is really not just his credentials, but it's his mindset, his contrarian approach to movement science, really. He doesn't really chase the popular answer. He challenges them. Whether he's developing a breakthrough assessment tool, some type of measurement performance, Paul really brings a critical thinking that really turns good ideas into game-changing solutions. So with that being said, I really want to get into this. We spoke about this image, and let me actually just share the image so people get to see. This was posted online, and I shared it with uh, with Paul because I wanted to get a better understanding about this. So let me actually see if I can actually share this screen now. Apologies. And it really talks about the force velocity curve. Go.
By the way, thank you for that very kind introduction. And yeah, I've been a contrarian my whole professional life, which,
Me too.
yeah, so it definitely makes people uncomfortable, and I've garnered my share of enemies over the years. But I think, whenever the world is going left, someone has to go right. And we have to ask those questions like, why are we doing this? And so what? I think that's my favorite question is, so what? And hopefully we find some meaning in the answers, not just answers, but meaningful answers. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I think so. So let's start with that in our prep conversation that we had. What really stuck out to me with this idea of the force velocity relationship, and in one, I think it was a fundamental concept of exercise science, but it's one that's also often like misunderstood and dismissed. Can you walk me through what are some things that on a foundational aspect are misunderstood or poorly misunderstood?
Sure. And when we're looking at this, obviously, this is looking at athletes as being either force oriented or velocity oriented athletes. And then the idea of this is, what is the intersection? And so that's what the force velocity relationship is here. And we'll get into that in a second. Originally, though, a lot of the research looking at force velocity was just examining from a muscular contractile level what happens to force output as velocity changes. And all of that original research, which was done back in the 70s and 80s, was looking at muscle contractile capability. And those studies showed that as velocity increases, force decreases. So sometimes it's hard for people to wrap their heads around that. The first time I heard that, it was like, say what? I mean, if I'm going faster, shouldn't the force go up? And the reality is, when you test things isokinetically, It doesn't. So when you set isokinetic dynamometers at higher speeds, you see lower force production in the transducer. So what you're measuring as a force output. Um, that's changed, obviously, in our approach to force velocity has changed over the years, particularly in light of velocity-based training. So that came into vogue, what, about 10 years ago, Marcelo, roughly?
Yeah.
Is that when you
And
saw it hit the
Tendo
market?
sensors probably. Tendo sensors were probably the traditional thing that I saw in the strength and conditioning market. Um, the first, I think, accelerometer was mild test at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have several options today. So
Yeah, so now when we're looking at this chart here, this figure, what it's really doing is taking athletes and you have the y-axis, the force axis, F0 being your peak force output, and velocity axis is like which of one of these axes are you operating on? Are you more a velocity-based athlete or you're more a force-based athlete? And I think what's happening is we're pushing people because of velocity based training. I think what we're doing is pushing people towards working with lower loads and higher velocities as a thing. And I'm not sure that is always necessarily goal oriented or goal driven. It's just that's what's in vogue at the moment. And the question here is are we racing toward the middle of this thing? Are we trying to become too much velocity athlete and forgetting that there's a force component that we have to be dealing with?
yep. And that kind of reframes this conversation, right? Like the point of shifting focus velocity to acceleration. And that really is kind of what I really thought this was pretty powerful of an image. Um, it really brings me to like that question of, when is an athlete or when is anyone strong enough actually mean?
Right. Look, if we're looking at sprinters and the ultimate objective is to get someone to run 100 meters in a lower time, then ultimately their velocity is what's important. But if we're looking at training applications, the question is what gets you to that? What lowers your time? But you mentioned acceleration, and that's what's really become interesting to me because at the end of the day, the human body is basically an acceleration machine,
Mhm.
right? It's designed to accelerate objects, to move objects, but not just to move them, but to get them from a static or even if it's moving, to change the acceleration of an object so that we can reach certain movement goals. We can move objects, whether we're eating, drinking, accelerating something towards our mouth or accelerating our body towards some direction, or more importantly, what I've discovered is decelerating, which is also acceleration. And that to me, especially when it comes to athletic performance, the ability to slow velocity quickly is critical to performance and even health, overall health and efficiency.
100%. That's where most injuries occur too, right? Eccentric uh, contraction.
Yeah, I mean, look, the most notable injury I think that anybody will have seen in the last couple of weeks was Lindsey Vonn. I mean,
Oh,
you know,
heart.
she landed from a jump. I mean, it's
Oh,
not the time on the snow that ruptured her ACL. That didn't cause an ACL rupture, right? She took air and landed on one leg from that jump, and then her leg was not prepared to deal with the forces, the rotational forces and shear forces acting at her knee, and she tore her ACL. That's a deceleration problem.
so the argument to that though would be most strength coaches will say, well, she needs more force, more weight, or heavier loads.
Well, it may be true, but the question is, are they concentric loads or are they eccentric loads? And that's what's absent from a chart like this, like we could look at a chart like this and say, well, you could go faster or you could produce more force, but more force how? Like, in what is it concentric, or are we trying to produce force, or is it eccentric? Are we trying to absorb force? And that's missing here. In the case of ACL injuries, most of them that I've seen are deceleration problems. People don't necessarily tear their ACL doing a squat. They tear it landing from a jump. And those are two completely different problems, which both, by the way, require force. They're just different types of force application.
So, to add to that, now we can provide that biofeedback. That's the big change that I'm seeing. It was always in existence, but I think we misused or misappropriated data numbers, basically, like looking at average velocity and not really understanding what we should be looking at, right? Which is what we're talking about, is this acceleration through phases of movement, either absorption to inertia or to creating it dynamically. Um, so that I agree with you that data is missing here. Um, how does it look like though how does that look like in practice then?
That's a great question. I think, what we typically measure when you see these devices providing us with feedback on what we've done, we'll see peak force, peak power. Maybe we'll see average force, average power, average velocity. I think we're all very focused on the peak ones because those are the big numbers, right? So we want to see, well, what's our max velocity? What's our max force output? What I've come to understand over time is any human being can produce a lot of force in a very short period of time. And when I was at Cybex, we did this kind of testing on the arc trainer. The arc trainer, interestingly, I mean, would allow someone to create like 2,000 watts of power, which is extraordinary. And very few people can actually do it, and can sustain it. And that's really what it comes down to is you can get anybody for a nanosecond to produce 900, 1,000 watts. It's not that difficult. I mean, most people can approach that. The question is, how long can you keep it up? And so when I'm looking at human capacity or human capability, one is, what is their capacity for doing anything? How much can they produce? But then the next question is, what is their tolerance to that? So, yeah, you can generate 1,000 watts of power, but can you tolerate that for over a period of time? And that's when we start to see the athletic performance and capabilities of the individual. And for that, we need to be looking at things like impulses. And that's coming, right? You've seen that in some of the technology that you've been looking at. The technology that I'm developing is looking at impulse. So what kind of force are you producing? What kind of velocity are you producing? And when you multiply it by time, now you got an impulse. And so it gives you a sense of what is the tolerance to putting out that type of capacity? How long can you sustain it? Or how quickly does it drop off? And I think that decay factor is something that some of this technology is actually looking at, which I think is actually very clever.
I also feel like the technology now allows us to look at movement. And so when we're programming and periodizing something like this, we're not stuck to kind of the old tools that we've always had to use, or now kind of use what's unfortunately considered trendy or in vogue, right? When we're looking at ballistic med ball throws, we're looking at sled drags, or we're looking at kettlebell work, or we're looking at other tools here. Um, from a periodization standpoint, if we program for a balanced um, athletic development rather than optimizing a specific lift, um, what percentage of allocation should I be primarily uh, planning for in an adaptation? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a layered it's a basic question with a layered answer. This is not there's a simple answer here. And this goes back to work that Paavo Komi did and Toshio Moritani did. If you want to develop maximum power, you want to be working at about 30% of your 1RM as fast as possible. All right. If you want to develop strength, you want to be working at 85% of your 1RM and higher. I mean, these are general findings from traditional research that I think has been fairly consistent even today, right? Just because this was done back in the 90s or 80s doesn't mean it's not valid today. It was valid then, it's valid now. But that doesn't mean that more is better. And this is something that I think people look at this stuff and say, okay, I need to go faster, 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 and always faster. I need to go heavier and heavier and heavier and always heavier. And my approach is more is not better. Better is better. And so the question is, I think to answer your question, how do we load people for the optimal results? And some of the research that I like that addresses this goes way back to the 60s, actually, and that's Richard Berger's research. And, you know, if any of your listeners hasn't had a chance to look up Richard Berger, I think he was at Temple University back then. He did a whole series of studies looking at the effects of different training loads on strength gains over time. And what happens is if you're always looking to work at the highest output, whether it's for velocity or for force, if you do it repeatedly and consistently, eventually the nervous system says, I got this, I'm done. And the adaptation just stops, right? So you hit plateaus when you do that. So what he suggested and what his research found was that you want to vary the loads from workout to workout. You don't want to be working out at consistent loads over time. You want to be varying the loads. Heavier some days, lighter some days, increasing loads, decreasing velocity, decreasing loads, increasing velocity, and do wave-like periodized loading. And it's that constant change that actually stimulates the nervous system to adapt. It's not, I'm going to always work heavier, I'm going to always work fast. And that's where I think we get stuck in, well, what's in vogue right now? Like, what's the training method du jour? And I'm just going to stick to that. And we don't want to stick to anything. We want to do as many different things as we possibly can.
So that brings me to the next question here. There's been an explosion in tools and metrics, right, available. And we've talked about, like, you know, what should we actually be tracking and why? You know, because to your point, you know, everyone's been tracking average velocity, but we're still getting sport injuries. We're still not getting the desired training adaptation, and you're really scored or weighed on about availability of your athlete and outcome on the field in team sports, but for clients, it's results, right? So what are some actual things that we can track from a framework standpoint? I mean, I know in a heavy loads, it really doesn't matter if I have a wearable on there, and we've talked about that, or have a sensor even when on the lower side of that. So where do you feel like that framework exists?
It depends. So,
I'm waiting for it. I know eventually I'll get there.
it depends. I mean, look, if you're an endurance athlete, if you're running marathons, then you know you could track all kinds of things when you're running a marathon. You could look at your heart rate, and you could look at your split times, and you can look all the. I mean, a lot of people track heart rate when they're running, and I guess that tells you more or less what your efficiency is at any given time period, right? It's not an instantaneous thing. You want to look at it over a period of time to see how you're trending. But at the end of the day, when you're running a marathon, you know, they don't give the medal to the person with the lowest heart rate, right? They give the medal to the person with the lowest time. So the thing you want to be tracking is what is your time when you run? ultimately. Now, what you do to influence that time can change from day to day and your training methods and things like that, but that becomes your issue. And, if you're interested in weight loss, you can look at all the calories in and calories out and track that. At the end of the day, what matters is what you see on the bathroom scale. I mean, that's what you should ultimately be tracking. Now, do you want to look at lean body mass and other things like that? Sure. I mean, absolutely. But we have to think about, well, what is our objective? What are we training to do? What do we want to be able to accomplish? And then measure that. When it comes to strength development, what I see as an issue is sort of the randomness and subjectivity of the indices that we use in order to create a periodized program, right? So if you look at this force velocity relationship, going back to that chart that you showed, what a lot of these methods are based on is some percentage of RM. So what you do with velocity-based training in order to understand your strength is you're going to select a load around 20% of your RM. You're going to select a load about 70% of your RM. You're going to look at the velocities between at those two loads. And then there's a regression that goes from the light to the heavy and projects up to what your load would be if you were at like a zero velocity, and that tells you how strong you are. The problem with that is you're doing it based on an RM measurement that is subjective and arbitrary, right? Do a 10 RM. Well, okay, I did 10 reps. Could I have done 11, 12? Right? Maybe I could have done 15, but I did 10. Is that really all I can do? Can I do more weight at that rep range? So the numbers, the degree of variability we have around that measure is very, very high. And that's a challenge. So if we're going to base all of our strength training models on subjective arbitrary testing, we're going to get arbitrary results. So what I think we should be measuring is actual force output. Not using an impulse momentum model, which is just using time to work backwards to figure out what the force is, but actually measuring force output at different loads. And then we could look at power, we could look at acceleration. How well are we accelerating these loads? And I can get to acceleration really easily. If I measure force with a force transducer and I have time, I can get to acceleration very quickly. And so looking at those things allows me to more accurately assess someone's strength. And then once I have an accurate strength measurement, now all of those other formulas that I'm going to apply will be more effective, more accurate, more effective.
Can you talk about a protocol to get to get that number?
Yeah, so what I'm working with is a simple force time transducer. So it's very accurate. It measures force down to 500 grams. So it's got pretty good sensitivity. And if you're capturing it, 50, 60 hertz, you're going to get really good clean data out of that. Basically, you have this force transducer and you take a load and you pull it as fast as you possibly can. It doesn't have to be that heavy. Just pull it as fast as you can. So we know what rate of acceleration you can create with that load. This is Newton's second law of motion. Right? Acceleration is equal to force divided by mass, right? Not F equals ma. It's acceleration is force over mass. So theoretically, the heavier the mass, the more force I have to create in order to accelerate it, or as the mass gets heavier and heavier, my acceleration is dropping because I just can't produce enough force to accelerate it. So you take it at a lighter weight. I look at it actually at four different loads. So a very light load, a lighter load, an intermediate load, and a heavier load. What happens to my rate of acceleration as I'm dealing with these heavier loads? And then now I can do what we do is a curvilinear regression analysis in order to figure out what would the load be if I could barely accelerate it at all. And then that gives us your max load. And we use that with an impulse model. And now we understand exactly how strong you are. If I know how strong you are, now I can create velocity-based loads. I can create force-based training loads. I can do intermediate loads. I can create pyramids. I can do wave loading. And then there's something that I really have fallen in love with recently is something called cluster loading, which I find to be incredibly effective.
Want to give an example?
Cluster loading is, let's say you're going to do a weight and you're going to do a set of 12 reps, right? Whatever that weight is and what percentage you've got. So you can do a set of 12, or you can do 4 sets of 3 with a 15-second rest in between each one. You're doing the same total number of repetitions at load, so the same amount of work, but what you're doing is you're clustering them so that with each cluster, you're trying to move that weight fast and hard. And there's a neurophysiological function that is being addressed by that particular type of training, but there's some pretty good research out there. Actually, John Cronin, who's done a lot of strength research, he did a study in 2011 looking at cluster loading, and they found that strength and peak power output are significantly higher when you train that way versus traditional loading.
And when you're implementing it, are you implementing it in that conjugated method routinely, or do you unload, or do you, how long do you use it in your protocol, or is it something that you can regularly go to?
Like anything, if you do it too often, too regularly, it stops having an effect. So what you want to do is you want to throw it in there. I usually do it once a week if I'm going to train, for certain activities. But it's really important because what it does is it allows the nervous system to sustain its fast twitch activity. And that's something that people don't necessarily look at. And this, especially in light of everyone's obsessive focus on time under tension, is everybody has to have this maximum time under tension. And I think that's, if you're training for power, I think that's a significant mistake.
And then, so where is technology necessary in these types of workouts? Do you feel like what data value would be meaningful? I know I mentioned the catchphrase before, average velocity. I think it's just misunderstood. But
Mm-hmm.
would average velocity or max velocity, where is it applied well and where is it wrong?
Well, I think in this case, what you want to look at is your power output during each one of the clusters. So, because ultimately the goal is to sustain power through all that training, right? Rate of tension development, rate of force development. That's what you're really trying to sustain there, because ultimately that's where strength comes from. Not how much force you could produce, but how rapidly you could produce it. That's what we're trying to achieve. And so in using technology in a cluster environment, I want to see what happens to my force output as I'm going through each one of those clusters. And that will help me to modulate my load. If I see that my force output is dropping too quickly, my power output is dropping too quickly through those clusters, that means the weight's too heavy. And so I need to back it off a little bit so that I could sustain it, right? On the other hand, if I'm pushing really high, you need to see some drop off, right? You don't want it to be a flat line. If it's a flat line, it means you're not challenging yourself enough. So from one cluster to the next, you want to see a little bit of a decay, but not a really significant decay. If it's flat, that means you don't have enough load on there, so it's an indicator that it's time to move the load up.
I've seen literature talking about 20% drop off being an indicator for hypertrophy in that regard. But that's what you're trying to do, right? Again, it depends on outcome. Um,
Yeah, so that to me, 20% drop off in velocity or force?
Force.
Yeah. So 20% is, if you're producing, 100 pounds of force at the beginning and, at your last rep, you're at 80 pounds. I mean, that's a reasonable drop off, I think, if you're working on strength. If you're working on endurance, um, I think you need to go pretty long. You want to, and I don't necessarily train for reps when I'm looking at endurance training. Usually I'm doing time now. So I've shifted that whole focus from rep based training to time based training, especially with endurance. And so I'm not, 15 reps is what, 20 seconds? I mean, that's not endurance. Endurance is like 3 minutes. That's endurance.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get that with your treadmill backward walking protocol. Um, People want to hear that one. I'll share it in the show notes. Uh, re Reps in reserve,
Yeah.
that's a lot of there's a lot of conversation around that. What are your comments on that one?
It's another method of trying to figure out what your maximum capacity is. To me, it's just another form of RPE, right? It's all right. So you've done a certain number of reps. Well, how many do you think you have left? And that would tell me how close you are to your max, and therefore I could predict your max. The problem with RIR is uh, the farther you are from your max, the harder it is to predict how many reps you have left. So with lighter and moderate loads, you're getting a really inaccurate prediction on those things. So you have to get pretty close to your max anyway. So if you're that close to your max, then what do I need some fancy metric? Just like I'm there. I mean, I've got 3 left. It's you're almost max testing anyway at that point. But it also depends on, well, how much load are you using?
Yeah,
And how fast are you moving it? And I mean, when you're moving faster, you're going to fatigue faster. So what is the pacing associated with it? And every time you test, are you going to test at the same pace, or are you going to test with the same loads? It's some other form of RPE, and I just don't think, given the fact that we have so much technology available, I wouldn't bother with that. I would just use technology.
yeah. I mean, the one thing that keeps getting left out, I think, in this type of measurable outcome is really movement efficiency. And it's a piece that I think that if we really talk about it, what's practical about the programming? If What are some real world techniques really that just kind of help in bridging that? Is it video analysis? Um, is it enough to have just that power data, the acceleration data? What does basically, because really now to have a metric is not really meaningful. And part of our pre-talk about this, we talked about the intelligence now and the load variation. What does that actually look like? And how does that new technology look like? And that for people that are listening, I'm talking about predictive um, tools now for the AI side of this.
Yeah, my question with a lot of data is, again, it's so what? I mean, we get all this information and we need to understand how to use it first and foremost. Is it, are the data meaningful and are they actionable? Can we actually do something with the information? And my favorite example is, in the Apple Watch now, if you're a runner, it'll tell you what your stride length is. Okay, so what do I do with that? If I'm a casual runner, if I'm even a trainer, what is the relationship between my stride length and anything that I'm doing while I'm running? And do I understand, first of all, what a stride is?
Yeah,
Because a stride and a step are 2 completely different things. And so, all right, my stride length is 1.2 meters. Okay, now what?
yeah,
So, how does that help me necessarily as a runner, unless there's someone there to interpret that information for me? Biomechanically, I would know what to do with it, but that's not necessarily something that everybody can. So when we're looking at peak power, I think other than people have sort of a general idea of what power means, most people don't understand what power is. Most people don't understand what acceleration is. You ask people to explain it, they can't. They know that cars accelerate, objects accelerate, but they don't necessarily know what it means. Even force. I've had conversations with fitness professionals and said, well, what's force? And they'll say, well, force is F equals ma. I'm like, okay, well, that's a formula, that's an equation. But what is it actually? And nobody answers that question. So, where do we start? Like, we have these tools that give us all this information. And if we don't understand fundamentally what the information is in the first place, I don't know what we do with it. Then you become really dependent on the AI to just tell you what to do. And maybe that's what we ultimately want, right? We just want to be told what to do.
I'm torn on that subject. Like I could understand if a person doesn't want to. I think a person should understand it to be able to program or use it, as well as to find value in the device you're going to be spending your hard-earned money on. Even in a business, I most recently had this discussion with another business owner and operator talking about recovery and bringing equipment in there. You know, if it's not going to, if you people get buyer's remorse, people don't understand that investment. So, like to kind of bring it back to our discussion, we're seeing a trend of technology not only in the strength space, but we're also seeing it in the resisted sprint training space. Um, Basically tethering now these lines to athletes and loading them or accelerating them through movement. Um, which the value there, does it really replace like maximal effort, or is it distinct? Is there something distinct there?
Hey, tethering a sprinter to a line and measuring their velocity is, it's a tool, it's a metric, it's a value, it's a benchmark. Here's their velocity, at the start, how rapidly do they get that going? So you could get acceleration. If you have velocity, you can get to acceleration. And ultimately, how long did it take them to cover this distance? So you can do that too. By the way, I could do that with a stopwatch. So does the technology give me more of an advantage? Well, the stopwatch is a discrete thing. I know exactly how long it took. The advantage of the technology, if you know what to do with it, is here's everything that happened from the starting point until the finish. There's all this variation in velocity. Like when you look at velocity, velocity is not constant. People don't run at a constant velocity, right? There's always variations in stride, there's variation in velocity. So we could measure variability, but then what do you do with it? Like, how does that apply to that individual? And if it's important, then what? How do you manage that? You can't eliminate that variability. That's just, we're humans, right? We have to be variable. But how then do we use that information in order to create a training program?
So we're basically having that same conversation of profiling that individual, assessing that individual, and then loading them where we've identified potential weaknesses, and then varying the intensities over a period of time and tracking their maximums, even their averages, uh, to provide biofeedback. But the challenge that I always seen with business owners and operators is we're communicating this initially for someone that's novice. The adaptations are neurological. Um, so traditional metrics, maybe like body compositioning, really don't capture that either. It's a baseline. How do we make this tangible to people, to people that are listening to this? Like, what are some things for help them understand?
I think the first thing, let's look at a different population because we've sort of been talking about performance
Yeah,
populations, like what do we do with athletes and
like us.
performance-oriented people. Let's take the average gym goer. So, how does the technology help? I think it does. I think the first thing that it does is that it creates a baseline value for somebody. You walk in, you get some measurements, whatever those measurements are, they don't have to be too sophisticated. Whatever they are, you have a baseline value. And the next thing that you do is you do periodic testing. Now, I think that's one area where, at least what I've seen over years, is gyms don't necessarily want to do that, right? You bring somebody in, you test them, and then 6 weeks later you test them again. And then the question for the gym operator is, well, what if they don't get results? Like, what if they don't see improvement? It's like a big gulp. Uh-oh. So there's somewhat of a reluctance for gyms to do retesting, but on another level, if you do, and your members see change, that's really motivating. So even if it's a basic metric, even if it isn't even that meaningful, if it changes, it's meaningful. If the actual metric isn't meaningful, but there's a change there, and you could say to that member, look, you're changing, that's motivating. And that's going to improve the lifetime value of that member. So you know what? I would do it. And just tracking, letting people see, if you're just looking at strength, you're just looking, I mean, I don't like to count reps, frankly, but a lot of these tools are rep counters. If you're showing that at a certain weight, you're doing more reps, you're saying, oh, look, you're able to tolerate more at this force output. Look, you're improving. That's going to help these businesses. So on that level, I think any of those devices will help.
It's a programming thing, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not just bringing in equipment. So they need to have, and that's the challenge. It's an operational, putting my business hat on, on a consulting side. That's always been the biggest challenge. People bring in technology and fail to see how that workflow works out to generate reoccurring revenue, but also the other variables: engagement, retention, utilization, lifetime value of your membership. Those are the things, and then this, to your point, biofeedback not only gamifies, but it also shows to your, like, I'm paying for this because I'm seeing value of this. And you shouldn't shy away from it, because that means you're actively trying to find out why is the results not being made. And that usually, my experience, and you're familiar with it as well, is eating, or it could be the whole other side of this whole situation, or sleep and other variables. And I think that's where I think um, I want to, kind of spend the rest of our conversation on, is taking a look at the gap between research and practice, and using wearable technology and sensor technology in facilities to kind of have a holistic approach where we can translate lab science, and these people could be their N of one, with technology that provides continuous information, and then have like clinical validated stuff that you regularly have that you can do at home as well. I mean, nothing, get a class 2 FDA blood pressure cuff, get, basic technology that's health oriented. But like, the other variable here is, I could look at a dashboard of my information, but am I looking at valuable information, right? And I think that's where this community has kind of wrongfully misinterpreted information, like sleep tools. I think there's value, don't get me wrong. Resting heart rate, resting HRV, sleep duration, sleep latency, those are decent metrics to look at that have been research based. Everything else, questionable. Activity monitoring, I think that as well. But I think the opportunity right now is really cool to exist, that we could actually do this type of research, but with tools, and kind of dumb it down, and not to overwhelm people with an AI deliverable. I think is a meaningful contribution that I think if we can coach trainers and coaches um, about this would be it's a no-brainer. It's possible now. You can take things off shelf, you can customize it, you can bring in programming. I think if a gym's not doing it now going forward, they're leaving a good amount of opportunity on the table.
I agree with you. The challenge that I see is any technology ultimately hits what I would refer to as a useful lifespan. I mean, it's the polar effect, right? And we taught people that they could run wearing a heart rate monitor or they could cycle with a heart rate monitor. And so initially everybody was strapping heart rate monitors on because they wanted to know what their heart rate was. And for a while, it's very useful. But then you reach this saturation point where you look at the data and you say, oh, I know this. I mean, I got it. Nothing's changing. This is okay. I'm all good now. I figured it out. And you throw the thing in the drawer and you never see it again. Just because new technology is introduced doesn't mean that phenomenon's never going to happen again. It always happens. And so I think the technology has to adapt also. You can start someone off at some point where you're giving them basic information, but eventually that information, as basic as it is, sort of becomes trite. It's like, okay, now I got it. Like, what next? And there's no next. And so I think the technology has to adapt. The technology has to change. If someone's on a certain progressive pathway, and all of a sudden you do something and they vary that from that pathway very significantly, how does the technology change in a way that understands that variation and then says, okay, now do this? And I'm not seeing anything out there that really does that effectively.
So that's kind of been that's the trail that everyone's on the wearable device side. I know we've tried, personally, I in the companies I've been involved in, we've looked at creating an AI coach that had this taking in different data points in a decision tree based on the assessment information, blood lab work. We were looking at VO2. We were looking at CO2 and O2 measurements throughout their stages of work so we can program the device more effectively. Otherwise, age defaulted, margin of errors are ridiculous. So to your
Mm-hmm.
point, that's why it goes back into the drawer within 6 to 8 months, and
Like,
people wait for the next tool, and it's a social building tool. It's strictly behavior based. But I think, like it or not, with the FDA recently passing this law that these are health units and can be incorporated, I don't know what that necessarily means yet for the digital CPT coding behind this. I would love to see that. I'd love to see clinicians actually now see what the hell's going on with their patient because it fills in the gaps. There's no argument with the episodic blood pressure measurement, blood glucose. Those are FDA. Their sampling rates are great. There's a standard. They've been properly tested and are have an ISO standard. So that's a medical. There's predictable outcomes you can measure on that compared to a wearable device that's a health recreational device. There's not that standard, and it's very black box in some cases. So there's no raw data access. You have to trust and assume that the brand is reputable.
mm-hmm.
And that's the biggest challenge and argument that I have, unless there is real research being done. And unfortunately, not every company does it. Sometimes they put their cart in front of the horse. Um, Well, that I think creates a larger conversation. But
Next time.
yeah, it's exactly right.
Next
So,
time.
so I want to let the community also know this is actually a conversation that there is going to be a next time. So I'm looking forward to having these these talks about strength and conditioning, but mentioning other aspects of bioinsights. So if you have any questions or comments about to Dr. Juris, please leave them in the comments. But PJ, I really want to thank you. This was a phenomenal conversation. Um, I know there's a lot of value here, so I'm excited to see how everyone response.
Thank you, Marcelo. It's a pleasure reconnecting and having this conversation I think is important, and there's so many different perspectives from which we can approach the main question here, and it just leads to a lot of different ideas. So I think I'm looking forward to what comes next.
Yeah, I definitely feel like we're velocity, the tech side of this, the strength and conditioning side of this is the next area of the gym floor that hasn't been digitized yet. So I think there's a really cool thing happening right now. And I think, we've had that discussion. What does it look like? What does the gym of the future look like? Um,
Hmm.
and It's really cool. I think I'm looking forward to the next one. So thanks again.
Thank you.
All righty.